There was a time in this country when a child could disappear after breakfast and not come home until the streetlights flickered on, and nobody, not a single parent on the block, would panic. No texts. No location sharing. No check-ins. Just a kid out in the world, alive and moving through it, learning how to exist. That time was the 1970s. And if you were lucky enough to grow up in it, you already know what's coming. And if you weren't, well, buckle up, because what you're about to hear is going to sound either like a fairy tale or a crime scene report, depending on how old you are. This is the story of the last truly free generation. The kids who got their knees scraped and their hearts hardened by the simple, beautiful, occasionally terrifying business of being young in America when America still let its kids run loose. Before the lawsuits. Before the helmets. Before the parental tracking apps and the bubble wrap and the hand sanitizer. Before all of it, there was just summer, and a bicycle, and a whole neighborhood waiting to be conquered. Let's go back. If you grew up in the 1970s, there's a decent chance that your earliest memories of family road trips involve staring up at a headliner while lying flat on your back on the rear window deck of your family's station wagon. Not in a seat. Not in a seatbelt. Just stretched out like a lizard on a rock, up on that flat little shelf right beneath the back windshield, watching telephone poles slide past against the sky. The sun would warm the glass above you, and the hum of the engine would lull you right to sleep, and your parents, up front, didn't give it a second thought. Because back then, nobody did. But that wasn't even the most dangerous real estate inside the average 1970s family wagon. No, the most coveted spot, the holy grail of childhood road travel, was the wayback, that rear-facing third row, or more often just the open cargo floor, where a group of kids could pile in like loose change and ride completely unrestrained, making faces at the drivers behind them, pressing their palms to the back window, watching the road unspool beneath them through the cracks in the tailgate. Some station wagons had those power rear windows that could roll down with the flick of a switch, and more than one kid spent a summer afternoon with their head hanging out into the open air while the highway blurred past at 60 miles an hour. Nobody was wearing a seatbelt. Nobody was sitting properly. And yet somehow, an entire generation survived the station wagon. The thing about growing up in the 1970s that people today genuinely cannot wrap their heads around is how little adult supervision was involved in a typical Tuesday. You woke up. You ate something. And then you left. That was it. There was no agenda, no scheduled playdate, no supervised enrichment activity waiting for you. You just went outside, and the world was yours to figure out. The only rule, the one sacred, inviolable law of 1970s childhood, was that you had to be home when the streetlights came on. That was it. That was the whole contract. Those streetlights were the clock of your childhood. You could be 3 blocks away or 3 neighborhoods over, but the moment you saw the first orange glow begin to buzz to life against the darkening sky, something in your chest would tighten and your legs would start moving. Kids across the entire neighborhood, simultaneously, like some kind of biological alarm had gone off, would start pointing their bikes toward home. It was one of the most reliable systems ever devised. No phone required. No GPS required. Just the fading light and the understanding that the world had edges, and the streetlight was one of them. The rest of the day, though? That was yours. And if it was a Saturday, a real, proper, 1970s Saturday morning, it started before the sun even had time to get its act together. You'd creep out of bed while the rest of the house was still dark and silent, and you'd pad down the hallway in your socks to the living room, where the television sat like a small piece of furniture that required genuine physical effort to operate. These were not sleek flat screens you could flick on with a voice command. These were heavy, warm, wood-paneled machines with manual dials that clicked through the channels one by one. You turned that knob with the kind of reverence a safecracker might give a combination lock, searching for the signal. And then it would come in. That glorious, ridiculous, perfect Saturday morning signal. Scooby-Doo chasing a ghost through a haunted hallway. Bugs Bunny outsmarting Elmer Fudd for the 400th time. The Super Friends assembling around a table to solve a problem that always seemed to involve a giant magnet or a volcano. You drag a blanket off your bed, build a nest on the living room floor, and plant yourself there with a bowl, and we're talking a serious bowl, a mixing bowl if you could get away with it, full of cereal that was technically not food. Quisp. Cap'n Crunch. Count Chocula. Sugar Smacks. Cereals that were essentially candy with a cartoon mascot on the box, and the prize inside was often something just as exciting as the show you were watching. You'd eat until the cereal was gone and then drink the colored milk at the bottom, and for those few quiet hours before your parents woke up, the television was entirely yours. No algorithm. No streaming menu. No infinite scroll of content. Just 3 or 4 channels and whatever they decided to give you, and somehow, it was always exactly enough. Those Saturday mornings also had a soundtrack, and that soundtrack came from the radio. Because in the 1970s, radio wasn't background noise, it was the pipeline. It was how you heard new music, how you discovered that a song existed, how you found out what was cool. And if you wanted to keep a song, to hold on to it, to play it back whenever you wanted, you had exactly one option. You had to record it yourself. This was the art of the cassette tape mixtape, and it required patience that no child today will ever be asked to develop. You'd sit beside your tape recorder, or your boombox if you were doing particularly well, with your finger hovering over the record button. And you'd wait. You'd listen to the DJ banter through 3 songs you didn't want, through a commercial for a furniture store, through a traffic report, through another song that was close but wasn't the one, and then, finally, the opening notes of your song would begin. And you'd slam that button down and hold your breath and pray, genuinely pray, that the DJ would keep his mouth shut through the intro. Because sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes he'd talk right over the first 8 bars with his call letters and his afternoon drive voice, and he'd wreck the whole thing, and you'd have to wait for the song to cycle back around and try again. When you got a clean recording, when the tape cut the whole thing from the very first note without a single word of DJ interference, it felt like a legitimate victory. Like you'd stolen something beautiful from the radio and made it yours. Those tapes were everything. They were currency. You'd trade them, share them, play them until the ribbons stretched and the sound went warbled and wobbly, and somehow you loved them even more for it. But most of the 1970s childhood wasn't spent indoors. It was spent outside, in the streets and the yards and the empty lots and the wild patches of land that existed in nearly every neighborhood, the places adults had no particular use for and therefore hadn't gotten around to fencing off or paving over yet. Every neighborhood had its version of the woods. It might have literally been a stand of trees behind the subdivision, or it might have been a drainage ditch thick with cattails, or a weedy vacant lot where an old house used to stand. Whatever it was, the kids had claimed it. Those spaces were the laboratories of childhood. You went in there and you built things. Forts out of fallen branches and old lumber dragged from someone's trash pile. Dams across a muddy creek using rocks and sticks and whatever came to hand. Holes dug for no particular reason other than to see what was down there, which was usually more dirt and sometimes an old bottle or a piece of rusted metal that seemed absolutely priceless at the time. You'd catch crawdads in the shallow water and carry them home in a coffee can, genuinely uncertain what you planned to do with them. You'd track animals, or try to, following prints in the mud with the same seriousness a ranger brings to a national park. You'd claim territory, give it names, defend it against rival groups of kids from the next street over. Nobody sent you there. Nobody organized it. Nobody handed you a worksheet about the ecological importance of riparian habitats. You just went, and you learned, and the woods taught you things that no classroom ever could, mostly about what your own limits were and how to push past them carefully. And then there were the machines. Because the 1970s was not an era of passive childhood. You didn't just consume things, you built them. The homemade go-kart was a rite of passage unto itself. Every kid on the block eventually tried to build one. The materials were whatever you could scavenge, a sheet of plywood, a couple of 2x4s, some wheels pulled off a broken lawnmower or stripped from an old baby carriage, a milk crate for a seat if you were feeling architectural about the whole thing. You'd nail it together, bolt the wheels on in a configuration that was always slightly asymmetrical, and at no point in the planning or construction process did anyone think to engineer a braking system. Brakes were for people who lacked confidence. The hill at the end of the block would handle the stopping, one way or another. You'd push that thing to the top of whatever incline was available, climb in, and send yourself down with the pure joyful recklessness of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid. Sometimes it worked perfectly. Sometimes a wheel fell off at the worst possible moment. Sometimes you ended up in someone's hedge or at the bottom of a ditch, and you climb out, assess the damage to yourself and the cart, and start figuring out how to fix it. Because you built it. Which meant you could fix it. That spirit, that physical, hands-on, figure-it-out-yourself spirit, ran through everything. The orange Hot Wheels track might be the most beautiful example of it. Those interlocking sections of bright orange flexible plastic that could be shaped into any configuration your imagination and your available furniture could support. You'd prop one end up on a stack of encyclopedias at the top of the stairs, run the track over a chair back, around a corner, through a loop if you had enough pieces, and down to a finish line on the kitchen floor. The engineering of it was real engineering. You had to think about gravity, momentum, the coefficient of friction on linoleum versus carpet. Nobody called it that. You just called it making the cars go fast. But the problem solving was genuine, and when you finally got the loop to work, when the little die-cast car made it all the way around without flying off the track, the satisfaction was enormous and completely self-generated. Nobody gave you a trophy for it. You just did it. And then you tried to make the loop bigger. The toys of the 1970s, taken as a whole, operated on a philosophy that has been almost entirely abandoned, the philosophy that children should be trusted with things that could actually hurt them. Lawn darts. Real ones. Metal-tipped, weighted projectiles that you threw in a high arc toward a plastic ring on the ground, and which, if your aim was off, would come back down like a small javelin anywhere in a generous radius. Glass clackers, two heavy glass balls on a string that you'd whip up and down until they clacked together with escalating speed, and which would occasionally shatter under the stress and send shards flying. Wood-burning kits with actual heating elements that got genuinely, seriously hot and that required no adult supervision to operate beyond the instruction booklet that came in the box. BB guns given to children as a matter of course, with the understanding that you'd point them at tin cans and not at your brother, though the boundary was tested regularly. These toys weren't accidents. They weren't regulatory oversights that slipped through some consumer safety gap. They were the norm. They were just what toys were. And kids learned from them, sometimes through pain, which was also considered a reasonable teacher. Pain, in the 1970s, was not a sign of trauma or negligence. It was just part of growing up. You crashed your bike because you were going too fast around a corner you'd taken 100 times before and overestimated your own skill, and you got up, pulled the gravel out of your palm, went home, and your mother put some Bactine on it. The Bactine stung worse than the fall, but you held still because you knew the alternative was mercurochrome, which was something else entirely. A bandage went on. A lecture about watching where you were going was delivered at medium volume. And that was it. You went back out. Because the neighborhood was still out there, and there were still hours of daylight left. You'd channel Evel Knievel, because of course you would. He was everywhere in the 1970s, on lunchboxes, on television specials, in the consciousness of every boy in America who had ever sat on a bicycle and looked at a row of garbage cans and thought, what if? You'd drag old plywood out of the garage and prop it up on bricks or cinder blocks at whatever angle seemed right, and you'd line up the cans, metal ones, the heavy kind, the ones that made an enormously satisfying sound when you clipped one, and you'd back up to get a running start. The ramp was never perfectly stable. The approach was never perfectly straight. The landing was always the variable you hadn't fully thought through. But you'd go anyway. And sometimes you made it, and the neighborhood watched and cheered, and sometimes you didn't, and the neighborhood still watched and you got up and tried again. Because that was what you did. The big wheel deserves its own moment of reverence in this story. That low-slung, loud, practically indestructible plastic trike with the oversized front wheel was not just a toy, it was a vehicle of pure expression. You could hit that handbrake at speed and spin out on concrete with a screech that carried half a block. You could lean into a corner and drift around it in a way that felt genuinely dangerous and genuinely thrilling. You'd race them down sidewalks, bang them over curb cuts, pile into them from running starts. They were loud and they were fast and they were completely yours in a way that adult-supervised activities simply couldn't be. Nobody coached you on your big wheel technique. You figured out what it could do by doing it. And when you got tired of doing things alone, you knocked on doors. This sounds so simple that it's easy to underestimate how much social intelligence it required. You'd ride your bike to a friend's house, sometimes a friend you'd made at school, sometimes a kid from another street you'd only talked to twice, but he had a pool, and you'd ring the bell or knock and wait. His mother would come to the door, and you'd say, with whatever manners you could assemble on short notice, "Can Tommy come out and play?" And she'd either say yes, or she'd say he's eating dinner, come back later, and you'd come back later. That was the whole system. No group chat. No coordination. No planning further ahead than the distance to the next doorbell. You showed up and you asked. And usually, someone came out. When enough kids came out, when the block hit a certain critical mass of children and bicycles and skates and summer evening energy, sometimes the whole thing would tip over into a block party. Not a planned one, though those happened too, the organized summer ones with the borrowed folding tables and the permit from the city, but the spontaneous kind, where someone dragged their lawn chairs to the end of the driveway, and a neighbor brought out a cooler, and the charcoal got lit, and before long the street had been informally reclaimed by the people who lived on it. Adults stood in the street drinking and talking. Kids rode bikes and roller skates down the middle of the road with nobody to stop them. The smell of charcoal and cut grass and someone's radio playing through a screen door was the smell of summer, and it was free, and it was right there, and it belonged to everyone. That's the thing that's hardest to explain to someone who didn't live it. It wasn't just freedom from rules, though there was that. It was something bigger and quieter. A sense that the neighborhood was a shared thing, that the street belonged to everyone on it, that the kids running through backyards and the adults watching from porches were all participating in something together without needing to name it or schedule it or post about it afterward. You knew your neighbors not because you'd been introduced at some organized gathering but because you'd grown up alongside them. Because you'd run through their yard and they'd run through yours. Because their mothers had your phone number and your mothers had theirs, and if something went wrong out in the neighborhood, if someone took a bad fall off a bike, or got into something they shouldn't have, there was always an adult somewhere on the block who knew whose kid you were and knew how to find your mother. That informal network was invisible, but it was strong. It was the whole infrastructure of 1970s childhood, and it didn't cost anything and it didn't require any technology and it worked remarkably well. The school year had its own textures, its own particular sensory memories that people who lived through them will carry forever. The smell of a fresh ditto sheet is the most powerful one, that sweet, slightly chemical, unmistakably purple ink smell of a mimeographed worksheet pulled hot off the machine and handed down the row of desks. Teachers would come in with a stack of them still warm from the machine, and every kid in the room would hold that paper up to their face and breathe it in. It smelled like school, in the specific, unrepeatable way that a certain era of school smelled. They stopped making those machines a long time ago. The smell is gone. But a generation of Americans still knows it exactly, carried somewhere in the deep storage of their nervous systems, ready to surface whenever someone mentions it. What all of these things, the wayback, the woods, the cassette tapes, the ramps, the ditto sheets, the streetlights, what they all share is something that is genuinely difficult to replicate now, though not for lack of love or good intention on anyone's part. They share the quality of being unmediated, of being between you and the world with nothing in between to cushion or schedule or supervise or record the experience. You fell off the bike and felt the road. You waited for the song and felt the waiting. You knocked on the door and felt the uncertainty of not knowing if anyone would answer. Every one of those experiences, however small, deposited something. Resilience, maybe. Patience. The ability to sit with boredom long enough to turn it into something else. The confidence that comes from having handled something, pain, uncertainty, a ramp that wasn't quite right, and having come out the other side. These weren't lessons that anyone planned to teach you. They were just what happened when children were given time and space and freedom and trusted to fill it. The kids who grew up in the 1970s carry that inside them. The memory of what it felt like to be small and unsupervised and entirely alive in a neighborhood that was entirely yours from breakfast until dark. The weight of that orange track in your hands as you snapped another section into place. The specific thrill of that cassette button clicking down at exactly the right moment. The way the streetlight looked, that first orange flicker, and what it felt like to race toward home through the warm summer dark with your whole body humming from a day of just living. That's what's gone. Not childhood. Not love, not care, not good parenting, those things are as present as they've ever been. What's gone is the specific texture of being young in a world that hadn't yet decided to protect you from itself. And for those who had it, no description will ever quite do it justice. And for those who didn't, well, you had to be there.